This horrifying story can destroy your credit rating and have a knock-on effect on the rest of your life. But I'm here to help prevent that from happening with a bit of guidance and a solution that I can offer you along the way with one of my partners, which is Incogni. So more about that a little bit later. So this story goes as follows. Let's call him John, not his real name, receives letters through the post demanding that he pay an outstanding bill of several £1,000s, which is allegedly owed to an energy company. The energy company have sold this debt on to a debt collection management company. They in turn have gone to what we call an identity tracing company, which are unregulated, by the way. Perhaps more about that in a minute, because I've got my own thoughts about that as well. This tracing company has then gone through various databases and information marketers and brokers, which I'll come back to in a moment, and found John's address that he was linked to many, many years before. Only he hasn't lived there for about 15 years, but he was indeed linked to that address as his childhood home, which his parents sold many years before. But they linked him to that address, and the people that were currently living at that address have obviously run up a bill with the energy company, which was in the last year or two. So nothing to do with John, but they ran up this bill at that original address in the last couple of years. They traced John to his current address, and then they pinned this current bill on John at his current address because John used to live in the previous address. Now, this might all sound a bit strange and a little bit far-fetched because John hasn't lived there for many years. But as you'll recall, this is an unregulated sort of sector with these identity tracers. And then once they pin that person's name to a debt, to an address, they then start chasing for the money. Now, reputable companies will join trade bodies and abide by certain codes of practice which prohibit such things. Even the Financial Ombudsman Service doesn't like this sort of practice of only using a name, address and a date of birth to pin a debt on somebody. But alas, some of them still do it. Now, what's the big problem with all of this? How does it happen? And then how can we do something about it? Well, let me start with the problem, because that's why I'm doing the video. The problem with this is if you receive these letters through the post and you ignore them, which might be a sensible suggestion for some people if it's genuinely not your debt, but if you ignore them to the degree that they then decide to take court action against you in your current name at your current address, or worse still, they try to report to credit reference agencies that it's you living at this address and it's your debt, that can have a detrimental effect on your credit rating. But even more than that, if they decide to take you to court for it and you still ignore it, this is the big problem, because a lot of people ignore these things when they think, well, it's nothing to do with me, so I'm just going to ignore it. They'll never prove that I owe this money, many people think. So if you just ignore the court documents, they will get judgment in default of your response to the claim form. So in other words, if you don't respond to the claim, you are deemed to accept it. And the court will just issue a judgment in default against you at your current address and everything else. Now, there are ways of dealing with that, but you do have to go back to court. You usually have to go through lawyers because with respect to most of you watching, it's probably a process that you're not familiar with, which is setting aside a judgment. And there are several things you need to establish in order for the court to set aside that judgment. But in the meantime, enforcement can continue. They can get a writ or warrant of control to seize and sell your goods. They can get an attachment to earnings order. They can even get a charging order against your property. Now, all of these things can be avoided if you respond to the claim form to say that it is nothing to do with you. But one of the reasons that this happens in the first place is when you use websites and you buy things and you give other companies your name and your address, your date of birth and various details about you, they are then put together as a package, which is why they get your details through these tracing companies. So that is where my partner for this video is useful, because Incogni is a service that when you sign up for it, you give them authorization to go to these companies to require that they remove your details from their databases. Because as I mentioned, there are hundreds of these data brokers that sell your data on to these tracing companies, but Incogni will require that, in accordance with data protection legislation, that they delete your data from their servers. They will give you regular updates as to when your data has been removed. And indeed, I, of course, have an exclusive discount for you with the link in the description below. And this could be useful for a number of different reasons, not just if you're being chased for a debt that you do not owe, but also perhaps you want to get away from spam and junk marketers, but more importantly, if you want to avoid the risk of impersonation, because we've had many people have their identity stolen in exactly this way, and they end up in exactly the same problem, in that they've got somebody pretending to be them, taking out loans and contracts with mobile phone companies and all of this sort of stuff. So this is one way of helping to remove your information from these data brokers' databases so that they can't be sold on to such tracing companies and then chase you for the money. And so once again, there's a discount code in the description below. It's BlackBeltBarrister. You'll get a significant discount off the service. I've used it myself and seen the weekly updates as to how many companies have been removing my data from their databases. So what do you do if you are in this position and you do have a mark on your credit rating and they are taking you to court and it's not your debt because it's from a property many years ago, and you haven't lived there for over 15 years, which was the case with John in my little story here? Well, unfortunately, you have to do a number of proactive things. It's not good enough to just sit and let it play out because you believe you're innocent. This is one of those where it might well feel like you are guilty until proven innocent. Not that this is a crime. We're not talking about crime, but that's the feeling many people get, just like the croaky voice that I've got today. So the number of things that you're going to have to do is, one, you'll have to contact credit reference agencies. There's a number of free websites you can do that with. You shouldn't have to pay to do that. So I'm not going to endorse any one or the other. As long as it's free, then, and it's not asking you for money, there are free ways of doing this. What you need to do if you're in that position is to make a note on your credit report and challenge any of these debts that are linked to you on your credit reference report that you dispute and you say have nothing to do with you. You need to raise a dispute to that and say that it is not yours, you didn't live there, it's not your debt, and they need to prove that it is. And at least then, if a future lender, let's say you're going for a mortgage because you're moving house, your new lender may look at that report and they'll see a note to say that it's in dispute and that they shouldn't really take quite so much notice of it as if you hadn't been in touch. The second thing is to do with the court process. If you do get a claim form and they are suing you, make sure that it's actually a sealed claim form with a number on it. That's when they're actually suing you. If they're just sending you letters and this goes on for a long time and they're not actually suing you, that itself might amount to harassment. I've done videos on that before where these scenarios do amount to harassment, and law firms have been successfully sued for harassment because they've bombarded the person with letters threatening to sue and telling them that they are taking steps when actually they haven't taken any such steps at all. So, but if they do sue you, you do need to respond to it. So if you do get a claim form and you do get particulars of claim telling you that you're being sued for this money, you do need to respond to the court, you do need to respond to the claim, and you simply refute step by step each thing that you disagree with. In the civil procedure rules, if you fail to deal with an allegation, you are taken to accept it. So you need to challenge each one that you disagree with. And the standard form of response to any of these things is you admit it, you don't admit it, or you deny it. And a little bit of explanation at either of those. The admit is quite straightforward. If they say that you are a certain person at a certain address, i.e. your real address, you can admit that. So long as it's absolutely accurate, you can admit that because that's true. If they say that you ran up a bill at this other address in the last 2 years, then you deny it because obviously you didn't. And not just deny it, because we can't just have a bare denial. A bare denial without proposing the true facts is not sufficient. You need to say, no, that didn't happen. It's not my debt. What actually happened is, and then whatever your true story is. You've been at this other address and you've been with a different energy company, and here's your real bill, and the other bill, the alleged debt against you, is nothing to do with you. And so you go through each of these processes and you tell them what you admit and what you do not admit. If in the event there is something that you just simply do not know, then you just say, I am unable to admit or deny this fact, and they are required to prove it. And that could be something, if they mention something about the other address and you have no idea which energy company the other address is with because you didn't live there, it's no longer your address. hasn't been your address for a long time. It's had a different energy company, but you don't know who it is. So you are unable to admit or deny which energy company was servicing that property because you didn't live there. And so they would be required to prove it. And in any event, you might say in your response to that, in any event, I didn't live there, so it doesn't matter which energy company it was. It is not my debt because I didn't live there. And so that's how you deal with it. But you would have to respond to it. Otherwise, you'll end up with a judgment in default against you, and they will be able to enforce it. And before long, you'll have bailiffs turning up to take away your car or any other possessions that they can, bar those that are restricted, such as the essentials for living. So I hope that has been useful. Do take note of my partner for this video, which is Incogni, which will help to prevent you from being in that situation. The link's in the description. They will ask all of these broker companies to remove your data from their databases because that is your right under data protection legislation. Unless there is a valid reason to retain your data, they must remove it. So I hope you found that useful. Please do subscribe, and I will see you next time.